Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this very special session on international taxation. Today, no business or policymaker can avoid the topic of international taxation. After the final reports of the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Action Plan were released in 2015, we are now in an era of digital disruption that is once again changing the course of international taxation. With the OECD trying to find international agreement on how to tax the digitalization of the global economy that is unlikely to happen before mid-2021, the tax world is at a crossroads between bilateral and multilateral tax policies. The vision and hope is for multilateralism, but the reality today is that unilateralism is happening as countries grow impatient. I hope this session will offer some clarity on the roadmap for the coming year and how you can navigate it. It is an incredible combination of circumstances that allow official representatives from the OECD, IMF, UN, and World Bank to make themselves available to give their contribution to this event. Faced with the challenges ahead, benefiting from the opinions of the most expert personalities in the field of taxation, and offering participants the opportunity to hear these speakers is central to the objective of TaxCOOP to provide an open and public forum. To begin, we have 4 pre-recorded videos for you, followed by a panel discussion. So the first video is an introduction from Pascal Saint-Amans, the director of the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration.
Should we move to more multilateralism or less multilateralism in the international tax system? That's the question. And actually, I think the answer I would like to provide, given where I come from, given my responsibilities, is pretty obvious. It's more multilateralism. But what is interesting is that we come from a time where international tax has almost been exclusively bilateral. It's only recently, around 10, 15 years ago, that multilateralism has become significant in the development of the international tax system. Actually, as you know, the history of international tax is that it started with tax treaties, and there was a model elaborated by the League of Nations. And this has been the box within which all the players, tax administrations, tax policymakers, and taxpayers have been playing within. And it's only recently that we have started thinking out of the box. And out of the box means that we have seen collectively, I think, that there was a need for multilateral action to regulate, from a tax perspective, globalization. So I would say that the past 12 to 15 years have been about introducing some form of tax regulation of globalization. And some would say that countries are getting more protectionist, are getting more concerned about their own sovereignty, and that this move towards more multilateralism in the tax system could be in contradiction with this more recent move towards unilateralism and more centric policies. But actually, and that's the tax paradox there, tax sovereignty, not to be only nominal, but to be real, requires tax cooperation. And tax cooperation in a globalized environment can only be carried out through multilateralism. And I think that explains the change of paradigm for the past 15 years, which started with enhancing tax cooperation in the field of exchanging information. That's the end of bank secrecy, 2008, 2009. The G20 emerged at the leaders level and decided to take action. I mean, the shortcut for the political speech there was, let's tackle tax havens being bank secrecy jurisdictions. And then we've moved to addressing the tax avoidance of multinational companies. That was the BEPS project for base erosion and profit shifting. And now we're moving to the next phase, which is trying to find the right regulation, the right sharing of the taxing rights between emerging economies, developing countries, but also between developed countries. And that has been about addressing the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy. But doing so and implementing the BEPS project, I think countries realized that they really needed to go a step further, the extra mile in making sure that tax competition, which for a long time has been considered as very beneficial, and it was only the harmful tax competitions, the harmful tax practices, which were considered as pretty negative. There has been a shift there, I think, and the shift has been initiated by the US, and quite paradoxically or surprisingly, the US Senate, held by the Republicans, who were very much in favor of tax competition, decided to position the US pretty well in the tax competition field by cutting the rate to 21%, but also to broaden the base and put a floor to the race to the bottom. That's the GILTI provision for global intangible low income tax. And that has triggered a broader move by many countries, which said, well, we want to benefit from the same type of limiting, putting an end to the race to the bottom. So if we look at the overall picture, what do we have? We have decades of bilateralism through tax treaties with old rules, the arm's length principle to decide how companies would price internal transactions with limited tax cooperation. We have a change, and in the 90s, there are attempts with the G7, with the OECD, but they are not very successful. And this really comes to fruition in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, until now. And in this new phase, we have the end of bank secrecy, tax cooperation, then we have some form of regulation of the aggressive tax planning of multinational companies, and now the ultimate step, which is still in the making, with the two-pillar approach on addressing the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy. Pillar one, determining a new nexus, which is going beyond the initial definition of the permanent establishment, and a new rule to reallocate profits, especially where there is a rent, there is an excess return, and that's the pillar one, which we now have as in the form of a blueprint, even though we've seen it's not yet agreed, the political conditions were not gathered to have agreement, but we have a detailed blueprint which would be quite fast to turn into a consensus-based solution. And we finally have the pillar two, the global minimum tax, the GLOBE proposal, which is kind of multilateralizing GILTI, which also has not yet been fully agreed, in particular because pillar one was not agreed, because the US and the other countries couldn't come to terms on how to define the scope of pillar one. So that had an impact on pillar two, but pillar two is well advanced too. Technically is almost finished. What is needed is a political agreement on the rate, on the carve out, on the subject to tax rules for developing countries. What's the balance between source and residence? But it's almost there. What's next? I think what's next is, and we'll see that in the coming weeks in the aftermath of this G20 meeting, which has just taken place. There is appetite still by all countries to move together with the 137 countries of the Global Forum. Will this be enough? We hope so. There may be some hiccups, some unilateral measures taken here and there, but I think we're moving towards an agreement in 2021 because the fundamentals are there. And the COVID crisis makes it even more necessary that we reach an agreement on taxing the digital company and the digitalization of the economy, adapting the rules to allow that countries would tax their fair share of profit, and on the other hand, putting a floor to the race to the bottom when the wages have been nationalized by many governments. The least governments can expect is that companies which have benefited from furlough, chômage partiel, and others would not locate in the future their profits in zero tax jurisdictions. Last word is about the overall context, the background. The background is domestic resource mobilization, which is a universal principle agreed by all the countries in the UN, and which puts the emphasis on the need for developing countries, for emerging economies, to better mobilize their domestic resources. And that's where we're so proud to work with the UN, with the IMF, with the World Bank, through the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, to make sure we mobilize the international resources to support the domestic resources. On that note, I thank you very much, and I hope we can meet in person soon and that we all overcome this COVID challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. So next you'll hear from Vitor Gaspar, the Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund.
So thanks to TaxCOOP2020 for the opportunity to address this important meeting. The story of international tax cooperation started about 100 years ago in the context of the League of Nations. And at that point in time, the main goal, the dominant goal, was to facilitate international financial and commercial relations. But already at that time, there was potential for tax competition, but these days, currently, there is much more potential for tax competition given the importance of globalization and the rise of multinational enterprises. In particular, the ability of multinational enterprises to shift profits towards lower tax jurisdiction has intensified with digitalization, but also with the increased importance of intangibles. International taxation originally focused on reducing or eliminating double taxation. At this point in time, there is an increased emphasis on avoiding profit shifting, and in that context, there was a change in emphasis, and at this point in time, we want to avoid double non-taxation. And that's the emphasis of the G20 OECD BEPS initiative. And it represents a very important progress, and it has achieved a lot in addressing profit shifting. Cooperation in tax is intrinsically difficult. The more countries manage to cooperate and coordinate their tax policy, the strongest the incentive for other countries to defect on the agreement and therefore out-compete them. Global minimum taxes offer the promise to put a floor on tax competition. We at the International Monetary Fund discussed minimum taxes in a 2019 policy paper along with other reform options for the international corporate tax system. Minimum taxes are now under consideration in the context of the inclusive framework, specifically in the context of its work on digitalization. The recent proposals for minimum taxes should not be confused with proposals to have a minimum tax rate. Instead, they are taxes aimed at compensating for undertaxation in another country. They come in two forms. A minimum tax on outward investment is applied in the country of residence if the source country does not tax profits generated at a sufficient level. A minimum tax on inbound investment is the alternative and is applied if profits are shifted out of the source country and not adequately taxed when they are received. These minimum taxes potentially reduce the gains from profit shifting. and therefore are an important instrument for international tax coordination. In general, the problems faced by advanced economies and the developing countries are similar. There are two aspects that typically should be taken into account, especially from the viewpoint of developing countries. First, many of them are source only rather than resident countries. Very few, if any, multinationals have headquarters in developing countries. Second, many developing countries depend strongly on the export of natural resources. To capture corporate income taxation at source, an inbound investment minimum tax can allow these countries to safeguard the tax base related to foreign multinationals, even where they have limited capacity to enforce complicated transfer price regulations. In the ongoing discussion about how to allocate taxing rights between residents and source countries, it will be important for the sake of developing countries to give high priority to those rules that ensure minimum taxation at source. There are many other complications and interesting issues, but for the sake of time, I will omit those in this address. And I want to end on an optimistic note. While globalization and digitalization have created tremendous challenges for the existing international tax system, this can be overcome with a combination of global cooperation and unilateral policy action. I therefore welcome very much events like TaxCOOP2020 that contribute to an international exchange of ideas and experiences. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Vitor. Next, we have a presentation from Navid Hanif, the Director of Financing for Sustainable Development at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs.
Thank you for the opportunity to address this meeting. The United Nations stands for a fair and transparent international tax system, a system that takes into account the interest of all stakeholders and countries, and is especially focused on sustainable development of least developed countries and others in special situations. We particularly see as key stakeholders in tax systems the wider citizenry, including those below taxing thresholds. They rightfully expect tax systems promoting sustainable development. Advancing such a tax system is not, for us, a question of multilateral or unilateral action. Rather, it is about an effective multi-layered approach. Let me illustrate this perspective in 3 ways, which I think also help point us toward the best paths forward. Firstly, in our work, multilateral approaches inform regional, bilateral, and unilateral responses, and vice versa. An example is the work of the UN Committee on International Cooperation in Tax Matters. In one of its major focus areas, this representative group of experts takes a multilateral approach to developing guidance on international tax treaties and on domestic tax law. The last point is important because treaties only preserve taxing rights that already exist in domestic law. They do not create new taxing rights. The UN model Double taxation convention helps inform bilateral treaty negotiations, but it also is informed by them. The 2017 update to the UN model drew upon developing country practice in seeking a special provision on taxing fees for technical services, more specifically Article 12A. It systematized discussion on such provisions, including pros and cons, and provided drafting aimed to reduce the spaghetti bowl of differently worded provisions that benefits taxpayers and administrators. Important current and emerging committee guidance on issues such as carbon taxation and extractive industry taxation also represent examples of the value of multilateral discussion of domestic and bilateral tax matters. Secondly, multilateral effort need to be built on firm foundations. Effective multilateral approaches depend on a certain degree of agreement on what the key issues are and how to deal with them fairly. It can take some time to establish whether even there is this minimum level of agreement. The convening power of the UN, along with other bodies such as the OECD and the IMF, can certainly facilitate this. For instance, agreeing on what the issues are before you agree to negotiate a solution, which means negotiating about negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, the world faces a situation now where ways of doing business have changed, so that models fundamentally basing taxation upon specific physical connections over a period of time are no longer acceptable to many countries and the wider citizenry. From the multilateral perspective, the challenge is how to build a system responsive and proactive to further changes in how business is done, including because of the changing expectations of consumers. And we need to do this at a time of heightened urgency to mobilize resources for COVID-19 response and a sustained recovery, as well as accelerating digitalization of the economy. OECD is sensibly looking at ways of keeping multilateral agreements up with the times. Any such mechanisms need to be fair between countries in different positions and between different stakeholders in tax systems, with accountability at the domestic as well as international levels. They also need to be practical. Many developing countries are the places where business wants to be. Their growth opportunities are the greatest. For multilateral solutions to succeed, developing countries, including the least developed, need to be front and center in the key policy and administrative decisions. Thirdly, any successful multilateral regime for international taxation must have an important place for withholding taxes, which one could think of as a unilateral approach. This is because such taxes, while imperfect, have first proven to be practicably administrable. Second, they can preemptively combat the sometimes elaborate structures used to disappear profits. Thirdly, they apply over a rolling basis to the benefit of a country's cash flow. Finally, they give some certainty to both taxpayers and administrators. Obviously, some of these benefits to governments can be negatives for business. And once we have accepted the legitimacy and appropriateness of withholding taxes, we can work to improve them, including by better functioning refund systems, better adapted to more digitalized and contact-free ways of doing business. Ladies and gentlemen, we at the UN have long advocated for moderate and easily administered withholding taxes. And the case for these, discussed at a multilateral level, implemented domestically, and confirmed by treaty, is stronger than ever. Thank you.
Finally, you'll hear from Marcello Estevão, the Global Director of the World Bank Group's Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice.
It's a great pleasure to be here in this panel with such esteemed colleagues and collaborators. In my view, it is important from the outset to recall that challenging international taxation are part of a broader set of challenges facing sustainable development and inclusive growth around the world. Changing the nature of economies, in the structure of companies, in the ways of doing business, in technology, in the composition of human societies, all contribute to an increasingly complex world. This much I think is clear and well known. Equally evident is that as globalization has made us increasingly interdependent, as it has brought much gains, it has also had serious failings, particularly in exacerbating inequality in some places. These shortcomings have contributed to putting the global political and economic system under great stress. So effective global cooperation to solve our current challenges is the only way forward to alleviating this stress. It is only by working together that we can revive our societies, economies, and our planet. International taxation represents one of the most important areas through which this global cooperation must be realized. If on the one hand, the scale of the challenge involved in international tax competition are arguably greater and more pressing than ever before, I believe the good news is that the scale of the challenge is matched by a much greater readiness and willingness to cooperate to solve our current issues. We have achieved some important results already, from avoiding double taxation to mutual assistance to collect taxes or recover assets through the exchange of information and joint investigations. But the journey we must chart together is still long, and pressing challenges remain, including notably the need to find common solutions for the modernization and adaptation of the tax system to our increasingly digitalizing world. Now, it is true that we need an efficient international tax cooperation system, but I do not think that there is a magic recipe for efficient cooperation. And in my experience working both the public and the private sector, cooperation is not always smooth. Progress is not always linear, nor is success always guaranteed. What we have is our key principles, our basic ingredients, as we can call them, that we must adhere to and encourage one another, including, first, a foundation of basic respect and appreciation of the needs and constraints we each face. Second, a common identification of the broad problems we face. Third, put in place an inclusive process that can build trust among all relevant stakeholders. Fourth, cultivating a culture of problem solving and innovative solutions, including drawing on ideas developed within academia, international organizations, and civil society at large that can be put in action, of course. And fifth, bringing a willingness to compromise, which means that single individual party must give due consideration to the interests and needs of the others. In short, cooperation is hard work. The platform of collaboration on tax, so-called PCT, is a very good example of cooperation among the 4 institutions representing this panel today. Since its inception in 2016, with the secretariat housed in my department, the PCT has consolidated the collaboration among the World Bank, the Fund, the OECD, and the United Nations in support of stronger tax systems in developing and emerging economies. This collaboration takes different forms, such as a consensus captured in toolkits for practical advice to low-capacity countries. For example, on the design and undertaking of successful negotiations, or in the form of knowledge sharing. The PCT website also includes an online integrated platform with information of tax-related projects pursued by the 4 partners, which also contributes to better collaboration and contribution at the country level. Now, it's not easy to ensure the international tax rules are appropriate for both developing and developed countries in the years to come. Of course, it is easy to say that we need to compromise, to find simple solutions, and to ensure that these solutions can be operationalized. One of the main challenges, though, that I see currently for developing countries is capacity to effectively implement tax rules. And here I think it is our responsibility to support them to enhance their capacity in this area. And by our, I mean all the international organizations as well. On international taxation, we have already made important progress by putting together processes through which we are actively practicing the key principles. For example, in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, the Base Erosion and Profit Sharing, so-called BEPS, initiative has emerged and has provided tangible results. From the leadership role of the OECD and the G20 in the inception of the BEPS project in 2013, collaboration with governments worldwide and with international organizations, including the IMF, the United Nations, and the World Bank, has helped ensure that the inclusive framework, which initially came to fruition in Kyoto, Japan, has today over 135 countries and jurisdictions as members, and 14 active observer organizations, including my own. In response to the enhanced priority for domestic revenue mobilization in the Finance for Development agenda, underpinned by the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the IMF, the United Nations, the World Bank, and other international partners have stepped up cooperation on tax matters, including the PCT that I mentioned earlier. Through the inclusive framework, through the PCT, through other forms of collaboration, and our own capacity building efforts, we can support developing countries improve their capacity to effectively implement new tax reforms that are urgently needed to address existing gaps. And it is through this type of collaboration support that we can help all our member countries reach consensus to problems such as how to tax the digital economy more effectively and fairly. Here, I'm proud to say that the World Bank plays its role. We have been contributing to thought leadership on international taxation. We are supporting over 50 countries in the efforts to implement international tax standards and strengthen their knowledge and capacity to deal with international tax issues. Finally, we partner with all the international organizations represented here today and beyond to push forward the process of compromise and cooperation. Despite the scale of challenges, I'm therefore confident that with hard work and the right processes and ingredients in place, tax coordination and collaboration will win out over harmful tax competition. Thanks very much.